Good morning. It's great to see everybody. We're very thankful that you could be with us. We have a nice crowd this morning and we have several visitors, and we're always thankful to have you and want you to know that you're welcome to come back anytime. Pressure is nothing new for most of us. James, who was the half-brother of Jesus, wrote to the Jewish Christians who were in the first century. And as most of you know, they were enduring intense pressure. They were being persecuted. They had things coming at them from every side. And so James is one of the greatest books that we can look at to help deal with some of the pressure that's in our life. Specifically this morning, we're going to spend most of our time in James chapter 3. And notice what he says about our speech. The average person spends 1/5 of our time talking. That's what the statistics say. You know, what's interesting though is I had always read that women talk more than men, and I still believe that. But there's a new study that came out that said that's actually not true. I don't think that study's right. You know, in the last 100 years, how many studies have we had? Thousands that say women talk more? I know last week I got in trouble because I talked about dogs. Now I'm alienating half the population. I know I'm going to get in trouble for this one too. But I think it's very true. But statistics say that if all of our words were put into print, the result of it would be this. A single day's words would fill a 50-page book. And in a year, we would fill 132 books with 200 pages each. Just imagine how much we say. And the power of our words has so much power today, either for good or for bad. Among all of those words are bound to be some that were spoken in anger or carelessness or haste. Brian Bill uses an interesting illustration to illustrate the duality of the tongue. He writes this. Several years ago, my wife Beth and I went to a friend's house for a party. After we were done eating, a group of adults started playing volleyball while the kids did a scavenger hunt. After the hunt, the kids divided into 3 different groups, and each group picked up a bed sheet and stretched it out, while a couple of adults started launching water balloons up into the air. The idea was for the kids to catch the water balloons before they broke. Here's where I come in, Brian says. I was recruited to take part in the balloon launching. I must confess that I was drawn to the balloon launching, not out of compassion for the kids, but because I wanted to blast the water balloons at those who were playing volleyball. We took turns gently lofting the balloons to the kids, and then pulling back as hard as we could and aiming at the volleyball players. And here's how he concludes, and I think this is an important thing to notice. He says, our balloons were small, and yet they had the opportunity to delight or to cause destruction, depending on how they were used. Likewise, our words have the same power. They can bring joy or they can bring despair. Proverbs 18:21 puts it this way. Whoops, not that way. It says, words kill. Words give life. They're either poison or fruit. You choose. Another translation just says, the tongue has the power of life and death. Our words can either bring life or our words can bring death. They can build others up or they can tear them down. Our study, as I mentioned, is going to center on the book of James. The book of James is a very short book. It only has 5 short chapters. It's known for its practical wisdom. It's known for its common sense. Throughout the letter, James helps his viewers, or not viewers, his readers, those listening to what he writes. He helps them understand their trials from God's perspective and helps them attempt to bridle their tongue and pull back their anger and resist temptation. Because the church in James at this time was tolerating evil. They were showing favoritism. They were participating in fighting. They were participating in slander. They were lying about one another. In short, almost everything they did was using their tongue to destroy one another. Eleanor Roosevelt said, great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. The church that James was writing to was full of small-minded people who were gossiping about one another, who were tearing one another apart with their tongues and their speech. We're really quick to avoid murder. We're quick to avoid stealing, drunkenness. But yet when it comes to using our tongues for destruction, way too many of us are very quick to leave a path of destruction in our wake because of how we use our tongues, our speech. Husbands have not literally stabbed their wives, but they might as well have, because they stabbed them with words as sharp as daggers. Wives have launched out at their husbands with tongues that cut and pierce. Just think about the devastating power that parents have when they talk to their children, when they repeatedly blast them with venom. Our children have exploded at their parents with words that have leveled the family almost like a bomb would. Churches have been wiped out because of what people have said. Now, I know our lesson today is a simple one. You've heard these things before. You're probably not going to hear anything new today. But that doesn't mean we don't need to hear it. Because if we didn't need to hear it, then we wouldn't have problems with our tongues, would we? But Scripture makes it clear that we all have problems with our tongues. I know some of you are probably going to tune out pretty quick. So I just want you to think about one thing. And then if you want to tune out, I'm not going to say feel free, because you shouldn't. But if you do, I get it. I would just want you to ask how you're using your tongue. Are you using it to help? Are you using it to build up the people around you? Listen to what James writes. Take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself. But Scripture doesn't stop there, does it? What else does it say? And his religion is worthless. If you and I are launching verbal balloons of destruction, then they are going to have devastating consequences on those who are around us. Our words have a direct correlation with our spirituality. We don't like to think about that, but they do. If we don't exhibit control over our tongues, we render our religion of no value. It will be useless. Think about that for a minute. Think about that person at work that you've been talking to, that you've been telling them how important God is for their lives. All it takes is one time. Maybe it shouldn't be this way, but it is. All it takes is one time for you. And everything that you spent the last year talking to them about is done when you say the wrong thing. One time. Now, I agree, it probably shouldn't be that way, but it is. It doesn't change the fact that it is. I remember as a teenager, it used to drive me crazy because Dad would lecture me all the time. Well, he still lectures me, so I've never got out of that. But he used to lecture me all the time about, dressing in a nice suit and things like that, and because of the way people perceive you. And I remember I went to a gas station late at night one time, and I was just wearing jeans and a shirt. And this was before the days of credit cards, so you actually pumped your gas and then went and paid in cash. And I went to pump my gas and nothing happened. I had to go in, pay them first, and then come out and pump my gas. The next time I went to the same place, late at night, midnight, dressed in a suit. As soon as I got out of the car, they said, "Sir, go ahead and pump." I'm the same person. It's the same time of night. But yet, the way that I came across to others was completely different, wasn't it? We do the same with our tongue. James continues his treatment of the words that come out of our mouths by devoting almost all of chapter 3 to this topic. In verse 2 of chapter 3, he says, "We all stumble in many ways. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check." Now, the word perfect here can mean complete. And it is actually a banking term that means that a banking note has come to terms, that a banking note is now complete. And if we're able to discipline our tongue, it proves that we are a mature person. The problem is, Scripture says we can't without God. No matter how hard we try, we fail. And I want us to notice how James connects the sins of the tongue with the sins of the body. He does this because our words usually lead to deeds. The hardest sins to control are the sins of the tongue. But a mature person is able at least to strive to keep that part of their anatomy in check. Proverbs 21 says, "Whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble." You know, when I read this verse, I think about, I'm not going to say any specific people. You can think about them yourself, I'm sure, and know people I'm talking about. But as a teenager, I think about all of the times that we almost, or did, with my group of friends, get into fights. And it was always, I don't know where that came from. It was always one or two people who could not keep their mouth shut. Who, when somebody would say something, they would get in their face and say something right back. And they never liked my rule, because my rule was, if somebody just, attacks you and you didn't deserve it, I will stand right there with you. If you opened your mouth and got you in trouble, I'm going to stand there and watch them beat you. Because I'm not going to get hurt because you're an idiot. But you can think about that. Maybe you don't have to think back that far. Maybe you think to work last week. Maybe you didn't get into a physical altercation, but what about a verbal one? If you had guarded your mouth, would things have turned out differently? The tongue remains hidden for the most part. But when it does show itself, it shows itself with devastating power. In verses 3 through 12, James uses 6 different word pictures to help us illustrate how powerful the tongue is. The first is the bit. The first is the metaphor of a bit that's put into a horse's mouth by a trainer or by a rider. This relatively small piece of metal can control the horse, directing it to turn left, turn right, to stop, to go backwards. When the bit is pulled back, it pushes against the horse's tongue and tells him to stop. The next illustration that he uses is that of a rudder. Just as a small rudder can control the direction of the largest of ships, our tongues control the direction of our lives. Now, what's interesting about the tongue and the bit is they actually have to overcome outside forces acting on them. I want you to think about that for just a second. Because with a ship, we have wind, we have the currents of the ocean pushing the ship around, and the rudder directs which way it goes. The rudder has to fight the winds and the currents of the outside. Those seem like pretty strong forces. But James goes even deeper. James uses the image of fire. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Just like a small spark can ignite an entire forest, words that flow out of our mouths can destroy families. They can corrupt lives. James uses very strong language to tell us how powerful our tongues are. And then he says that they are set on fire by hell itself. Like a careless match thrown into dry grass, our words demolish people around us. Now, I know that we almost never intend for that to happen. We don't usually set off saying, I'm going to destroy this person today. You've heard this story, but it fits in well, and I want to share it once again. After Karen Carpenter died of heart failure at age 32, that was brought on by years of an eating disorder, it came out that her fatal obsession with her weight was triggered by one reviewer's comment. One person And think about how famous she was. When referring to Karen, this man called her Richard's chubby little sister. Well, I'm sure that there were other factors that contributed to her struggles. This one comment unleashed a fury of self-doubt, which led to her eventual disease and her death. I know sometimes we feel like we are powerless. Sometimes we feel like there's nothing that we can do that makes a difference in the world around us. But we forget how powerful our speech is. We forget that we can either use it for good or for evil. We need to watch our words. And especially this morning, I would encourage us to make sure that we do that with our children. It pains me and drives me a little crazy, honestly makes me a little irritated, when I'm around parents and I hear them telling their children how bad they are, how evil they are, how horrible they are, how you put in the word. Think about what that does to our children. What if we said, what you did was wrong? Isn't that different? Doesn't sound much different, does it? But we're saying what you did, your action was wrong, but I still love you. It's a tragedy when our kids grow up thinking that they're naughty, that they're bratty, that they're chubby, that they're ugly. We have to separate what they do from who they are. And as much as we have to do that for our kids, we have to do that for one another as well. Do you remember the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me? I don't know who came up with this, but I'm pretty sure they were an idiot. Because, I know, I'm saying things I shouldn't say out loud, huh? But words do hurt, don't they? They scar, they leave wounds all the way to our soul. See, apparently I'm not taking my own lesson very well. It's just... Well, see, I haven't got to the part where we have to practically put things into use, so maybe I'll get better once we get there. But how many people have maimed you or killed you with their words? How many people have you hurt with your words? Are your kids dying a slow death because of your vocabulary? Is your tongue quick to criticize? Are you beating your kids down, or are you replenishing their love tanks every day? In The 5 Love Languages, many of us have talked about that. If you haven't read that book, it's a great book to read. Because in it there is there's a lot of things that are useful. But I love the concept of the love tank, especially as it relates to our kids. That book encourages you to ask your spouse, how is your love tank today? And the love tank simply is, how much love do you have built up inside of you? Is your tank full, or is your tank empty? James goes on to tell us that our words are also like a dangerous animal. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, creatures of the sea, are being tamed and have been tamed by man, but no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. Isn't it amazing when we think about it? Think about all of these creatures, and we get them to do all kinds of crazy things. Charles was just talking on our way here about at the Nugget, they used to have a couple of elephants that they walked up and down the road every day. Many of you are shaking your heads, you remember that? We can teach lions to jump through burning hoops. We can teach grizzly bears to be able to ride on the back of horses. We can teach elephants to do handstands. But we can't seem to control just that little bitty tiny muscle that's in our mouth. We bless God and we blast others. There's something wrong with that picture. The 5th illustration that James uses is that of a spring. He says, can both fresh water and salt water flow out of the same spring? In the Middle East today, there are still freshwater springs in the area. There are also saltwater springs in the area. But there are no springs that one day put out fresh water and the next day decide to put out salt water and then go back and forth. It doesn't happen. It is one or the other. It's not possible to do both. And yet we attempt to. We say, but I am a good person. I say good things. Sometimes. His last illustration is that of fruit. My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? We expect a fig tree to have figs, don't we? And we expect a grapevine to have grapes. Nature reproduces its kind after its kind. And James is simply calling us to be consistent. And the reason he's calling us to be consistent is because the fruit that we produce on the outside is because of our hearts on the inside. And I know this is probably uncomfortable to say, uncomfortable to think about, but if we are saying things that we shouldn't, it's not really a problem with our tongue. It's a problem with our heart. I want to give us a number of steps to consider taking today. Because I don't think it's enough to just talk about how powerful our tongues are. It's not even enough to walk away with a better understanding of the passage that we talked about today. If we want to have tame tongues, at least as possible as it is to have them, then we have to put into practice what we've heard. So my number one suggestion for you this morning is to read the book of Proverbs and read the book of James. The book of Proverbs has 31 chapters. We just started a new month. Now, granted, we're a few days in. But if you will read a chapter a day from each of them after a month, you will have read through the entire book of Proverbs one time and the book of James 6 times. Proverbs is full of just amazing tidbits of wisdom. Here's just a couple. Well, I don't know why I put that behind the thing, but it says, a man who lacks judgment derides his neighbor, but a man of understanding holds his tongue. Excuse me. Proverbs 12:8 says, reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Number 2. This one's probably a little more difficult. Think before you speak. Now, obviously, I don't always do this. I haven't done that today. Because most of the things that popped out of my mouth were not on my paper. They just popped out of my mouth. But there's a young mother who I read about who asked her kids a question on a regular basis. And I love this question. She says, are your words flames or are your words flowers? That helps our children realize that they have a choice to make. They can either plant flowers that are going to grow into something great, or they can shoot flame and tear down things. Now, I don't know who it is that came up with this acronym, but I think it's a good one. Because before we speak, sometimes I think we should ask ourselves these 5 questions. And notice that they spell think. Is it true? Number 1. The more interesting it is, the more likely it is to be false. And even if it is true, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should speak about it. Number 2, ask the question, is it helpful? And I think most of the time, if we were going through these, we would stop right there. Is it helpful? It might be true. It might be fun to talk about. But is it helpful? Will your words help bring about a solution to the problem? Number 3, is it inspiring? Will your words build someone up? Is it even necessary? Do you have to say anything at all? Is saying something just going to make you feel better? Or is it actually going to help? You know, Christy will do this sometimes because she'll be really angry at somebody and she'll like write down this scathing email and show it to me and say, can I send this? Like, you're asking me, you know you can't send it. But she feels so much better after doing it. And she's not the only one. I remember when I was studying with Greg Gay, there was somebody who did something. And, you know, I don't get too irritated very often. Well, I get a little irritated. But I don't get, like, really irritated that often. But I was really irritated with this person. And I wrote down, like, this is before computer stuff. So I wrote down, like, 3 pages. And I showed it to Greg, and I'm like, and he said, well, it is all true. But do you think it will help? I'm like, no, it's not going to help, but it helps me feel better. But sometimes we don't have to say anything. And the last one, is it kind? Are your words really based on a desire to help? Notice I didn't say on a desire to make you feel better. I said on a desire to help. Okay, if thinking before speaking is hard, this next one's going to be even harder. We need to talk less. Our chances of blowing it with our words are directly proportional to the amount of time we spend with our mouth open. Abraham Lincoln once said, "It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt." He's not the only one. Calvin Coolidge said, "I have never been hurt by anything I did not say." Proverbs 10:19 puts it a different way. It says, "When words are many, sin is not absent, but he who holds his tongue is wise." I read about a woman who had a very serious throat condition. Her doctor said that her vocal cords needed complete rest, that she could not utter a word. She was forbidden to talk for 6 months. Now, that would be hard for anybody. Christy's got her eyes about that big, because you can imagine how hard it would be for her or for Nathan. This woman had a husband. She had 6 children. It seemed impossible. How could she keep her mouth shut for 6 months? So they developed something. When she needed something, she blew a whistle. And then she used pads of paper to write down and communicate with her family. After 6 months, when she was allowed to use her voice again, she was asked what it was like to only communicate in writing. And I love what she said. She said this: "You would be surprised at how many notes I crumpled up and threw into the trash before I gave them to anyone. Seeing my words before anyone heard them had an effect that I don't think I can ever forget." We can learn a lot from that, can't we? We don't have to say everything that comes to our mind. And if you're like me, though, you're really good at fooling yourself. You're really good at saying, well, the only reason I'm saying this is to help them, right? I want to provide a solution to the problem that they have because they're too dumb to figure it out. You may not say that, but that's what's in your mind, right? King David, after seeing how his words got him in trouble, wrote Psalm 39:1. And, oops, apparently I skipped a couple of verses here, but Psalm 39:1 at the bottom. "I will watch my ways and keep my tongue from sin. I will put a muzzle on my mouth." It took King Solomon getting in trouble with his mouth before he realized that he needed to keep it shut. We might not be able to stop talking for 6 months. But I think if we will really think about the impact of our words, we will talk less. Number 4, build others up. The Bible continually reminds us to encourage one another. One author said that we should never complain about our spouse's faults, because if it were not for their faults, they would find somebody much better than us to marry in the beginning. So we need to be careful. We need to think before we speak. And ask ourselves, are we speaking words that bring death? Or are we speaking words that bring life? Proverbs 12:25 says, "An anxious heart weighs a man down, but a kind word cheers him up." We all have different things that encourage us. And most of the time, words of encouragement don't do much for me. But when I hear somebody saying good things about me to somebody else, they do. And I know this is jaded, and this is another thing I probably shouldn't say out loud, but when somebody says good things, my first thing is, okay, what do they want? when they say it to me. But when I hear them talking to somebody else, then I know it's not about me. It's real. I want to challenge us today to give everyone that we talk to at least one encouraging word. Now, for some of us, we're going to have to be really deliberate. Christy's again looking at me because this is not my strong point. And now you don't have to shake your head so everybody can see that this is not my strong point. But for some of us, we will have to be very deliberate. We're going to have to really think about something to say to encourage somebody, because it may not come naturally. The last thing that I want us to think about this morning is, where does all the garbage that comes out of our mouth come from? It comes from our heart, doesn't it? Ezekiel 36 and verse 26 says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Jesus gives us some insight into our heart in Matthew chapter 12 and in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 19. For out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, lies, and slander. It's going to take more than just willpower and determination, because our tongue is a restless evil. Scripture says it is a ferocious beast. It will not be subdued. It is like that serpent with deadly poison. We need to have a new heart. And if we want to stop using words that will kill and begin speaking words of life, the only way to do that is to change the source of those words in the beginning, to change our heart. The good news for us today is that Jesus specializes in heart transplants. He specializes in helping us cure our hearts. But I want to remind us, because I think sometimes we get discouraged too easily. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. If you've been out with your friends for the last 20 years, saying things that you shouldn't, it's not going to change overnight. And even if you've been a Christian for the last 30 years, no matter how hard we try, there will be times when we fail to hold our tongue. On a windswept hill on an English countryside, there is a drab gray slate tombstone. The quaint stone bears an epitaph that is not easily seen unless you stand over it and look right down. Faintly etched on this tombstone are the words, "Beneath this stone, a lump of clay, lies Arabella Young, who on the 24th of May began to hold her tongue." For some of us, that's the only time that we're ever truly going to hold our tongue. Publius, who was a Greek sage, wrote these words. He said, "I have often regretted my speech, never my silence." Our speech and the type of wisdom that we use governs our heart. So what does our tongue reveal about our heart? You know, at the beginning we mentioned that there would be over, I forget what it was, 200 different books. 132 books with 200 pages each, filled with our speech. If someone who didn't know us just sat down and read what we had said for the last year, what kind of picture would they think? How would they describe you to someone? James taught that apart from Christ, it is impossible to really control our tongue. But with Him, all things are possible. We're still going to struggle, but if we really stop and think before we speak, then we can hurt those around us a lot less. You know, sometimes the things that we speak bring pressure on us, but more often than not, they are pressure points to others. Pressure will either make us stronger or it will crush us. God is here to do His part. The question is, are we willing to do ours? I know our lesson is a simple one, but it's one that we all struggle with. And it's one that I hope that we will work toward fixing. We never want to close without offering an invitation. If there's someone here today who's never given your life to Christ, we invite you to do that. Come believing, repenting of your sins, confessing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and being baptized in the watery grave of baptism. Or if you've done that, but you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters, you need God's forgiveness, come forward as we stand and sing number 648.